Hey, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our spring YouTube Live with P.S. Aford. I'm Todd Bedard, past president and host of the YouTube Live. Jessica Piccone-Cook will be joining us here really soon. She is driving to her mom's house tonight, and we'll be broadcasting live from her mom's house and back after a 1-week absence from season 2 of our administrator track YouTube Live. We'd like to welcome back Brian Robinson, assistant. Actually, now he's a new associate principal at Cumberland Valley High School. Say hi, Brian.
Hello, I even dressed up. That's how excited I am to be here.
Nice, that's awesome. I didn't wear any Eagles garb tonight. That's surprising. Well, anyway, folks, we have a extra special guest for you tonight. He is our 2019 keynote at the state convention. He'll be joining us in Spooky Nook December 6th. That is December 6th at Spooky Nook at our convention this year. It's a keynote. We are focusing a little bit this season on his book, Learning Transform, which he co-wrote with Eric Sheninger. And a secret announcement right now, Eric Sheninger will be our 2020 keynote out at Spooky Nook as well. So we got both authors of that book. It was that good. And we're so happy to have with us tonight Thomas Murray. So Thomas, if you could just introduce yourself and say hi to our viewers.
Sure. Hey, everybody. You know, you were saying extra special guests, so I'm looking down like who else is on this chat. I know they're not talking about me. But then the second thing I hear, so if you're bringing in my co-author, at least we can bring the varsity to this year's conference, and then the
That's
JV
correct.
can kick off next year's conference. Now, hey, everybody. So I'm Tom Murray. In my day job, I'm the Director of Innovation for Future Ready Schools. So I know many of us who are here in Pennsylvania, myself included. This has nothing to do with the Future Ready Index. I get that question all the time in Pennsylvania, totally separate. And so it's Future Ready Schools. So if you check out futureready.org, it's free. We don't sell anything. And so it's really for school and district leaders on transforming schools. And some of the topics that we'll touch tonight will be there as well. But I'm also an author, as Ted shared. And I spent 15 years in public schools here in Pennsylvania as a teacher at the elementary level, as a middle school teacher. And then I was a middle school principal, an elementary principal. And then I worked over at district office for a total of about 15 years. I obviously couldn't keep a job, so I went to work now in Washington, D.C. I think that probably makes sense, right? So it's awesome to be with you all tonight. I am super jacked up about our conference in December. For me, Pennsylvania is home. So anytime I get to be here, it's just rewarding to be with my Pennsylvania colleagues. So I'm fired up. And I know last year you had one of my best friends in Joe Sanfilippo, and I know his energy is tough to beat and tough to match, but I'm going to bring it for you, and maybe he can even make a guest appearance. So I'm excited to be with you, but great to be with everybody tonight.
Thanks, Tom. We really appreciate you being here as well. So let's dig right in. Learning Transform. That was a book that was been on my list for about a year, and I finally grabbed it this year when we knew we were getting you, because I wanted to be a little more familiar with it the closer we got to this. How did that book come about? Did Eric call you? Did you call Eric? Did you guys see a void in education?
Yeah. So Eric and I both, most of our work really focuses on working with school and district leaders. So in a given year, I'll work with a few thousand superintendents, a few thousand principals, many lead teachers, instructional coaches, and folks like that. And, you know, Eric and I continued to see many of these themes arise over time of questions that we would be getting or needs in certain buildings. You know, I can tell you, I've been to some of the poorest places in our country. I'm talking 100% free reduced lunch. Every child lives in poverty. And yet many times in those cases, I see those buildings on very reduced budgets still doing great things for kids. You know, like what was a commonality there? But in the same sense, you know, I've been to some places that they're some of the wealthiest places in our country, and they're not talking about going 1-to-1. They're like, we're going 3-to-1, baby. We got it all. We give them a cell phone and an iPad and a Chromebook. They got it all. And sometimes they're doing it like they did 30 years ago. And so what were some of those key differences? And so maybe we'll dive into some of those concepts tonight. But here's what I know, regardless of where I go in the country, there's amazing people working so hard and working their hearts out for kids. So we really wrote Learning Transform to really support educators from research to practice. There's a lot of research throughout Learning Transform, over 100 different studies that we pull from in different ways, because we really believe, to be honest, Eric and I do, that there's also a lot of fluff out there in education that we're spending, and we mean that as respectfully as possible, but we're spending lots of money on different stuff, and it's new or it's shiny or it's a cool tool or whatever the case might be. But when we peel it back a little bit, is it really leading to deeper learning outcomes? So what is it that actually works? So we really wrote it to be a guide, almost Sir Ken Robinson called it like a blueprint, and to be able to like support what are the key buckets bucket areas that our schools need to really transform and move forward. But recognizing, again, every educator is working their hearts out for kids, and also schools have great things happening already, and we fully recognize that. So how do we amplify the positive, but at the same time, take those areas that we can grow and keep moving them forward for kids? So on one hand, yes, it came out of need. On the other hand, it really came as a support for school and district leaders on here's what we could find that actually works. And so we can dive into some of that tonight.
So Tom, I don't want to nerd out and turn everyone off right off the bat and talk about research, but what I really liked about your book was how you infused the research right into it in a way that's seamless and it makes sense. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of research that you guys were focused on and where you went for that research?
Sure. So Eric and I were really in tune with making sure that it was objective from the get-go. You know, I think you can find research to probably support almost anything you want. And so we're upfront about that. There's a lot of there's a number of the chapters. I'm thinking about the professional learning chapter on how do we make professional learning personal, where we pointed out there was studies we found that really contrasted each other. You know, one study was saying one thing and the other study was really saying something different. And so what did we do? We just shared it with the reader. Like, why do we believe that these two studies are contrasting? And so, you know, for us, it's looking at quality of research. You know, it's when you go out there, one of the places we would start, we would look at a lot of organizations. There's a tremendous amount of nonprofits out there that really are devoting incredible amounts of time and money to do deep levels of research. And we want to make sure that it's not, you know, just some little case study that had 12 participants in one classroom in some remote village somewhere, right? We want to make sure that it's relevant. And so when we looked at research, we wanted to look at cases where there was urban districts or rural districts. As we know, many of our rural districts, if we're talking here in Pennsylvania, have different needs than Philadelphia or Pittsburgh or Allentown or places like that. And, you know, there's certainly a lot of needs that overlap, but there's also some unique pieces to that. So we tried to find as much as we could. So one of the examples is Linda Darling-Hammond's probably one of the top known educational researchers in the world. We're fortunate that she's on my board where I work in Washington, D.C. And so we were able to take some of her work, and it's really, that's kind of the gold standard when you look at educational research. Her name is all over the place in that, but it has to be true research, whether it's, you know, peer reviewed or whatever the case might be, but taking a look at, you know, what were their sample sizes and you know, how long did they study things? And so when we really tried to make sure that we found the best of the best, but also making it current. You know, you can pull ed tech research from 20 years ago, but you've got to ask yourself, like, is that even remotely relevant in a way when everything has changed since then? You know, if they're citing things when you had 3 desktops in a classroom and you're citing that to defend an argument today, it may have been relevant 20 years ago, but it's not today. So we wanted to make sure that things were up to date as well. So we wanted to be transparent. We wanted to give principals like yourself, and congrats, by the way, principals like yourself or superintendents or whoever was reading it, really some of the ammo to say, here's some of the why behind it. And going back to, you know, take a space and take an example of, you know, we looked at chapter 4, that's on learning spaces and how do we make learning spaces more learner centered. On one hand, that's an area in our country that I would say on social media has also become very fluffy or very over glorified, in my opinion, on some of the wrong things. And I mean that very respectfully when I say that. But the flip side is you can look at some of the research behind things that we can do in our classrooms that don't cost $1, but are really more about learning sciences or the way the brain works. And so I will also tell you, I learned a lot writing the book. We did not come at Learning Transformed of like, we have all these answers and all the solutions to everything you have to do. When you start researching something like leadership and studying the work of John Maxwell or Simon Sinek, people outside of education, you're bound to learn a lot of things. And so, you know, I'd hesitate to say I learned just as much in writing the book, but there were so many things that were really aha moments for me, or things, whether it was making professional learning personal or learning spaces or even technology on some of those pieces or culture or whatever have you, that I certainly learned in that process. So we started with as much as we could. If we found contrasting research, we really wanted to point it out. We really did want it to be evidence-based and not just fly by night. So whether it was peer reviewed or whatever the case might be, or out of universities that had large sample sizes. But yeah, there's over 100 different studies in it, but hopefully it's supporting some of the compelling why, as well as the sense of urgency for educators in supporting the mission and why change.
That's awesome. We're going to visit the actual learning environment here later in this discussion tonight. But I just want to back up for a minute. You talked about technology and just putting technology in kids' hands and putting technology in teachers' hands. In your experience, when you travel around the country, do you see a lot of districts just saying, "Okay, here's the technology. Good luck, have fun," and there's a deficiency in professional development with it, or professional learning is a better term, or are you seeing, and are those the ones that aren't successful? What are you seeing on that front of things, and what can we do? What can we do if we don't have that professional development? Like in my district, we're very fortunate. We have a professional development director, and we seek out teacher leaders and so on, and do seminars all the time. But I don't know that that goes on everywhere. So I just want your thoughts.
Yeah. So my honest response is it's all over the map. There's some places that I would say are really doing it well, and professional learning is a huge aspect to that. But it's also understanding what is it that actually works. Going back to the idea that we over glorify things on social media, you know, sometimes I think we get this notion of just because something is digital, it means it's any good. Like you can be 100% digital, 100% online, 100% using digital tools, and 100% low level learning. And I think sometimes we're like glorifying on social media, like I'm totally paperless. Like at the end of the day, with all due respect, who cares if you're all low level learning? And I say that as respectfully as I can, but taking a look, excuse me, taking a look at the, what I was looking at with the technology side, or what we were looking at, is like really what actually works. You know, one of the things that really, one of the stories that I'll tell actually in my next book when I choose to write it, is this notion of, I 18 years ago in my classroom, I was one-to-one. Let me say it again. 18 years ago, I was one-to-one Palm Pilots. Remember those things? One-to-one Palm Pilots. I remember being told that these things were going to like transform education, that, you know, this was going to totally engage every student. Let me tell you a quick story as to where this whole technology thing hit me very quickly. So I remember my principal was coming in, and I'll just set the tone with, I had an amazing principal who had a culture of innovation that pushed us instructionally, but also encouraged risk-taking. He was really dynamic. So anyway, so I'm one-to-one Palm Pilots. This is my second year teaching. I'm all jazzed up. He's coming in for, you know, an observation the second week, and he goes in the back, and I've got this 30-minute lesson. Now, don't laugh. It was a spelling lesson. At least 18 years ago, they all had their individual lists, right? So he comes in. I've got the Palm Pilots. I'm all jazzed up. Now, follow this for a moment. For 30 straight minutes, every single kid was engaged. For 30 straight minutes, every time I asked a question, every hand went up. It was like I was paying the kids because the principal was in the room, right? For 30 straight minutes, like my lesson plan was followed to the minute. After 30 minutes, I'm like, I crushed it. Here's what I did. So like the kids, they each had their own list. One of them would ask the other kids their spelling list. They had to write it on the Palm Pilots. They beamed it. Remember, you'd beam. It was the beginning to mobility, right? They'd beam it back over. That kid would check. So anyway, so I'm thinking for 30 minutes, like I am crushing this. I hope my principal captures this because I am just modeling how this is done. Like I hope he gets it, right? 30 straight minutes go. I go out to recess. I like drop the mic. I'm like, that's how it's done right there. That's engagement and technology use. I'm thinking to myself, I got this, right? I'm all fired up. So I remember I go down the next day, and like any principal is asked, and my friend, like, if you haven't asked yet, you will start to ask. Bill looks at me and he says, so Tom, how do you think the lesson went? And so I'm thinking, so Bill, I think it went really great. Every kid was engaged. Every time I asked a question, every hand was up. Every kid did exactly what I asked. My lesson plan was followed. I used technology the whole time. And so he smiles and he said, so Tom, what were your learning objectives? And I said, well, we wanted to use the Palm Pilots to be able to. And he said, no, stop. What were your learning objectives? And I'm thinking to myself, like, what, he didn't hear me? Like, we wanted to use the Palm Pilots to be able to. Bill turns and says to me, he says, Tom, I need to push you on this. Every time I ask you about learning, you start talking about technology. I still have never forgotten that. And then he followed it up and he said, Tom, let me push you on this. Was every kid engaged? Yes. Were all the hands up? Yeah. I said, but I need to push you on very low level tasks and very low level learning. And he really pushed me on. He said, Tom, let me ask you this question. And he said, did you have lots of great things? And he knew I was at a point where I was ready for this conversation. This was not a principal slapping me in the head, being like, you know, you're not good enough. He was pushing me instructionally, and 18 years later, I can still remember the conversation. That's how important it was back then. And so to be real quick with that, he said something along the lines of, Tom, let me ask you this. If you removed the technology from exactly what you did, and you just had two kids sitting side by side, pencil and paper, doing the exact same thing, could they have done it in 7 or 8 minutes instead of taking the 30 because of all the device stuff you did? And he was spot on. And I take 4 or 5 minutes to share that conversation and share that because it had such a big impact on me that I can still remember 18 years later, like it clicking being, it's not about the tech. Like I created that lesson because the tech could do something, not because it was the best way to learn something. And it's understanding from the tech and the research end really quickly that it's about explore, design, create, which by the way is eerily similar to Bloom's taxonomy, Webb's depth of knowledge. There's really a direct overlap. Or like the National Ed Tech Plan says, it's the active use, the creation, the design, which again is those higher level skills and not just necessarily what I would deem as probably our most, and I don't know this to be fact, but in my opinion, probably our most prevalent practice in our country. And it's really the digital worksheets. You know, something like a Chromebook can simply be a digital worksheet storage hub, but it can also be a pathway to unleash genius. It's how we use it. So really it comes down to technology as an amplifier. Technology will take great instructional practices and it'll amplify the opportunities. It'll amplify the depth of what's possible. The flip side from research that we point out in Learning Transformed that's very rarely talked about, it'll also speed up the rate of failure in lower level instructional environments. And that's hardly discussed. And so with that, it's not pointing out like, yeehaw, everybody's going to be on 50 apps in 50 minutes. It's really stepping back and saying, no, like you can be all digital and really low level. But in the flip side, it's a great tool. Just like any tool you'd have in the shed, it's the right tool at the right time for the right job. And so it's really important to take a look at that. But research really gets to what is it that actually works. So part of our world is help an admin understand that. Let me give you one more quick example. As a principal or a new principal walking in, you know what we often see, and I coach principals all the time, you know, you got your 5-minute walkthrough form and, you know, every district has something like that. You walk in. One of the things on the walkthrough form is what? Kids were using technology. Check. So let me push back. So what? 25 kids on 25 devices. What if it's all low-level learning? Check. And so when we take a look, what is it that actually works? We really have to know from research to practice. So our goal to help teachers, to help admin understand where's the depth come in, how can technology be a great amplifier so we're not spending the 17 or $18 billion a year that's projected to just digitize what we've always done.
Yeah, and that really sounds like a mindset shift that happened for you 18 years ago, and that came from, you know, a strong leader who had created that relationship with you to be able to ask those questions. I want to talk a little bit about culture, and you know, just like we can't pick our parents, you know, teachers can't oftentimes pick the admin and the culture that's created in their building. We had your good buddy George Kuros come in October, and he talked about how teachers, you know, need to shift their mindset and push admin. And I'm wondering, in your experiences, you know, how do you go about both, you know, because you're a teacher and then you're admin and then your district office staff, like how do you see the teachers being able to push and sustain a movement that will actually get up to admin and maybe even district office?
So great question. And George is a good buddy of mine, and he's an incredible presenter. I have no doubt that you had a great day with him. So taking a look, when I talk about culture, first recommendation I'd also look at is another one of my great friends, Jimmy Casas, wrote the book Culturize. If you're looking for a great book on that topic, he is phenomenal when it comes to that. But from my perspective, culture goes hand in hand with leadership. When I mention leadership, quite often whether it's a keynote or a workshop, when I'm working with a whole group of people, whether it's a few dozen or a few thousand, one of the questions I'll pose is, when I say school leader, who do you picture? Who do you envision? And I'll pause for a few moments. And I know what they're thinking. They're picturing the principal. They're picturing their superintendent. They're picturing what we call in Learning Transformed as leaders by title, which by default, yes, by title, you are a leader in that role per se. But some of the greatest school leaders I have ever seen are that third-year teacher that runs through walls for kids, or that support staff member that makes a few dollars an hour above minimum wage, yet is a backbone to that building. One of the pieces that's important to know about culture is every single one of us contributes to the culture in our school. You see, it's interesting when we talk about toxic environments. I wrote a post about it a couple of weeks ago. Toxic environments are a real thing. Toxic leadership is a real thing. Toxic teachers is also a real thing. And so sometimes on one hand, we'll see 50 people pointing at one as the principal and 50 people creating this cycle of negativity, this cycle of expecting things to go wrong or whatever the case might be, pointing at one, we've got to ask the converse. What would happen if those 50 people worked hard every day to make that the greatest building on the planet to work? And I know that sounds like a utopian-esque thought, but you know what we do often with culture is we point this way before we point this way. And if we're talking about culture being everybody else's responsibility, that's a mindset problem. You see, toxic school environments are never the children's fault. Toxic school environments are about me and my and I, not we and our and us. And so, yes, that is such a mindset. So on the flip side, a good friend of mine, Todd Whitaker, if you know any of Todd's books, one of the things Todd says is that school leaders, principals, you set the tone. And I totally agree with that. I've worked alongside or worked with a variety of administrators in my career, and I can certainly visualize. I just told a story about, Bill Gretzula. He's a superintendent in Pennsylvania right now. That was my principal at that point. And he created a culture of innovation, a culture of risk-taking, a culture where he modeled what was expected in that regard. But the flip side, I can certainly think of principals, and I don't want to say that I worked with whatever, that I've associated with some time in my life, because I would never throw anybody under the bus in that regard, that I would struggle to work for. So, I get that. But the flip side is you can control your actions. You can't control the people around you. So what would I say to teachers? Number one, you make that classroom the classroom that every single kid wants to be. Now, I'm not just talking about a fun zone, but what I'm talking about is create an environment that kids are running back to. One of the things I'll often say, I get to do a lot of welcome backs, and I'll do some here in Pennsylvania this year as well. And one of the things I'll really challenge teachers with on that welcome back is, what can you do on day one that has kids running back to your classroom on day two? And don't tell me you can't, because teachers are some of the most creative, dynamic, authentic people on the planet. So when we look at culture, what can teachers do? Number one is own it. Number two is recognize that you either contribute. I really believe that culture is every person, every adult in that building either builds it up a little bit or tears it down a little bit every single day. When you walk into that faculty room, do you build the energy up, or do you suck the air right out? And, we can think of colleagues, maybe not in our current buildings, but you know exactly what I'm talking about. And so it's recognizing that we as adults need to own it. We as adults need to do everything we can to make it the greatest place as we work. But if we are in leadership or admin positions by title, there's a lot more on our shoulders. And we need to recognize that our actions, our words really, really do matter. But when we look at Learning Transform, we called it leader by title, like I just shared earlier, or leader by action. So if I'm that teacher, what do? I do everything I can to make it the greatest place to work. I get that that's a lot easier said than done. I fully understand that. Here's the flip side. What's the alternative? To go into the faculty room and throw our hands up and complain every day? To me, that's not modeling what we would ask kids, because what would we say to kids here? And a lot of times the answers can become really clear and obvious if we just flip the conversation to what would we say to kids that come to us and say, I've got a teacher that is X, whatever it is, that's negative. We wouldn't say, just run out of the class, get out of it. What would we say? We would coach that kid. Are you doing everything that you can? Are you speaking up respectfully? Are you being nice to the people around you? Well, it's really the same conversation. And not to demean anybody in saying that, but you're talking about somebody in authority over the control of other people. And so when we look at it, how do we own it? How do we make it better? Because at the end of the day, we all need to be responsible for creating cultures where kids want to be and cultures where adults want to be. Let me give you two just objective points of view that we could take a look at. Take a look at things like in-service days. Take a look at things like faculty meetings. Do your attendance rates stay the same, increase, decrease? What does it do over that time? It's objective data. If we take a look in things like in-service days, always dip and go down, what's that tell you? For some reason, people don't find it valuable. We'd have to look at that as an example. Another objective thing when we take a look at the overall of culture is I've lost my train of thought there. I was so into that last thought, I forgot that one. End of the day, we need to own it. We need to be part of it. We need to see our role in it. And we need to point this way before we point this way. Pointing this way is really, really easy. Reflecting and looking in the mirror and say, what's my role in this mix? That's harder, but that's what professionals do.
In the book, you talk about, you kind of make a case for STEM and then project-based assessment and blended learning and competency-based assessment, and just show all of those different things, and several more, in fact. And I think I know the answer, but I'm going to throw it out there for the viewers that may wonder, because we all hear STEM, it's a buzzword. We all hear PBL, that's a buzzword. We all hear blended learning, we need to do that. And then if you have Schoology as part of your school, blended learning can be every class. So what do you see as best, and how do we figure that out for a
Sure.
school district?
So it's recognizing, number one, that you can be amazingly innovative with no technology at all, or amazingly traditional with all the technology in the world. And so when you think about like, what is it that's best for your culture? What is it that's best for your community? What is it that's going to create the best experience for kids? So in Learning Transform, we highlight a variety of things that, districts are doing. My advice would be, don't try and do it all. One of the things that we do as district leaders or building leaders is we get 47 initiatives a year, and like we launch something in September, we come back to it in May and we're like, hey, how did it go for you this year? And people are like, what are you even talking about? We didn't. Oh, I don't even remember September, right? So we have to avoid initiative overload, which is something that we address kind of in that last chapter. But at the end of the day, it's how do you make learning personal and authentic for kids? Some of the reasons things like, a STEM type of experience can be beneficial, and it's not just throwing Legos at kids. It's because you're talking about deeper learning experiences. You're not talking about just like going to the copy machine on a daily basis and picking up our packets. We're talking about things like creation and design. And so when we take an example of something like STEM, it's the deeper level thinking that becomes possible is why you'd want to do something like that. Another thing we point out is we look at some of our tech schools, like our VoTex as an example. VoTex have provided, in my opinion, over time, some of the most personal and authentic learning opportunities of any classroom anywhere. You don't go to a VoTech and see the plumber just learning on worksheets. Like you don't go to the VoTech and see like the electrician not standing near wires. Why? Because it's hands-on and it's personal. And so when we take a look, that's a great example. And I think in my opinion, under No Child Left Behind, we tried to take every kid and put them in this 4-year college box and say, this is where you have to fit. And so we started to look down on some of the VoTex areas where now they're turning around and they're providing kids with these amazing opportunities, amazing certifications. Kids are graduating high school and going to make significant money, like starting the following day. Like you ever pay a plumber on a Saturday? Like I think they're doing all right, right? Yeah. So at the end of the day, like what are those experiences coming down to? They're things that are more personal in nature or more authentic in nature. You mentioned competency-based. Some people call it mastery-based. Some people call it standards-based, whatever you want to call it. At the end of the day, what is it? It's breaking things down to give additional feedback or understand additionally what I need to work on. Why? So things are more personal in nature to me. Some districts have done it amazingly well. Some districts, it's been a dumpster fire when they've tried to do it, for lack of a better term. So it's not in the nation of what it is. And you'll also think about, in the past 3 minutes, everything, and a lot of it was repeating what you had said related to things that we wrote about, whether it's STEM or competency-based. We buzzword bingo the heck out of everything we do in education. That at the end of the day, what are we really talking about? And so one of the best pieces of advice that I can honestly give in that area is, and it's so simple, know what you're talking about inside your district. And I know that sounds like, what is he even talking about? The amount of times somebody will take something like blended learning, because you said that one example, and somebody will think, well, that's when they take some courses online and some in the classroom. And someone's like, no, he's talking about classroom. Sometimes even in our own principal group or principal committee, we'll take the phrase personalized learning. That's been kind of the main buzzword in the past couple of years. Ask 10 principals what that means. And you know what's going to happen? You get responses all over the map. And that's principals. How do I know? Because I do it all the time. And so when we look at it, whatever it is that we're talking about, we need to make sure that we're on the same page, using the same common language. Otherwise, teachers understandably are all over the place. And that's not a discredit to them by any means. You can't really blame them when the left hand doesn't seem to know what the right hand's doing. And then down to the kid level, it just creates some chaos and confusion, which then gets parents frustrated, showing up at the board meeting, then yelling at the board on whatever just happened. And so making sure that we're really on the same page with that, not just buzzwording bingo, not just hopping on the latest bandwagon, but making sure what is it that our kids need? How do we provide the greatest, most personal and authentic experience? How do we train our teachers along the way? Because you can call it whatever you want. If your teachers aren't actually doing it or trained to do it, it's not going to go well. And so lots more we could talk about there, but I'll leave it at that.
The buzzword bingo, that sounds like a hashtag for a Twitter chat we should do.
I know. I was just thinking that, Ted. I love that.
Yeah, well, that would be a good Twitter question. It really would be. It's like, what's your favorite educational buzzword? We don't have to steal that.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's going to be a Twitter poll here soon. Well, I loved what you said about talking about training teachers and how we're kind of helping them along the way. And I know a lot of educators, especially some that are newer to the profession, get that anxiety and lizard brain when they see an administrator walking in, whether it's just a casual walkthrough or whether it's to do an observation. But how can we get rid of that and really bridge that gap so that it doesn't feel like you're on the spot in a negative way when it comes to observation, and it can be more of a kind of reflective practice for younger teachers?
Yeah. So everything you just said, I can fully relate to when I was a teacher. Inherently, it comes from, I really believe teachers are wired to be perfectionists. Like, we expect ourselves to be perfect that first time. We write the lesson plan. It's followed to the minute. Every kid was engaged, formative assessment along the way. They nailed the summative assessment. Like, that's what we expect of ourselves. On one hand, that comes from high expectations. We don't want to lose that. On the other hand, we have to recognize we're human and we're going to screw it up at times. And that's not to demean anybody. That's just fact. We're human and it's not going to go well. So when we think about it, what advice do I have? Number one is, when you're confident and you're comfortable, invite people in. I think we often are, educators, it's so fascinating because we're also really humble people, and don't change that either. But don't talk about you, talk about them, because it's not about us, it's about them, being the kids. And so when you're confident and you're comfortable and things are going well, or you're super psyched about a lesson that's coming up, invite the principal in then. Because if it comes across as like a closed door kind of thing, and I'm just never in there until it's my 30-minute observation or whatever it is as the principal, that's all I'm going to see. Joe, who was your keynote last year, one of the things Joe Sanfilippo says all the time that I love is, in the absence of knowledge, people make up their own. He's typically talking about how we engage with our community, but it's really the same concept in our schools. If you're not highlighting the great things happening in your classroom, like, who's going to do it for you? And with that, so how do we share out the great things that were happening, but recognizing if I'm a first-year teacher, second-year teacher, it's a heck of a lot easier said than done. There's a huge intimidation factor of, like, I've got this principal that it's been at it their entire lives, and this is like, month 6 for me, and I'm just getting started. So the flip side to that is, going back to that culture of innovation, culture of yes. When I was supervising my teachers, I'm going to handle that 30-year veteran different than that first-year teacher. And yes, I get they all have the same contract and all that kind of stuff, but they're ready for different conversations. That first-year teacher, I'm probably going to handle with a little bit more kid gloves. Why? Because when I was 21 and I was teaching, I was screwing it up left and right. Like, I was not some perfect teacher, and you got to recognize that. And as principals, don't forget where you came from. Like, picture yourself in your first or second year before you open your mouth and talk to that first or second year teacher. And I think that humility will help bring us and guide us to where that conversation could go. But from a teacher end, be proud of your work. Because the other side that I see with teachers often is, we almost only know our classroom. And I think that's a fault of the structure or a fault of the system, because one of the best professional learning things is going to see other teachers do similar to what you do to learn and grow. But we rarely do that because, there's issues with money and those kinds of things. And we get that. But one of those things is, be proud in that work. And so sometimes as a principal, I can think about having conversations with teachers saying, wow, that was amazing. You're doing such incredible things. And the teacher almost looking at me being like, what are you talking about? Like, that's just how I do it. But they don't have the vantage point of seeing 20 other classrooms working on certain things, and they are rocking it. And so, principals really need to encourage others to share their story and those things as well. But be proud as teachers, because you're rocking it and doing amazing things for kids. I mean, if you're teaching phys ed and you've got 500 kids in your middle school, what other adult knows 500 teenagers by name, knows their strength, knows their needs, meets their emotional heart, and, and taps them there as well, and still crushes it and moves kids forward in skills? Like, give me another adult on the planet that does that, right? And so take that and be proud of it and share your story. Because again, it's just like communication with our community. If you're not doing it, like, nobody's doing it for you. And so with that, you got to own that there too.
It makes me think, I have to give a shout out. I had a student teacher last semester, Casey Vandergrift, who on one of my observation days, she's like, I hope you don't mind, but I asked the building principal to come in too. And I was just blown away by that she is a master's student. She did her undergrad at Slippery Rock, went through IUP, but she wanted as much feedback as she could get. And she's just somebody that gets it. So it was so refreshing to see that as a young teacher, student teacher, just opening her classroom door and trying to learn as much as she could through the process. I
can tell you as a principal, if I saw that and I knew that it was authentic, I would try and hire that person in a minute, because it shows that they're teachable. Because if our mindset, even as a 30-year veteran, is like, I've arrived, I have no room for growth. Like, what would you say to the kid in your classroom that's like, I've arrived, I've mastered it all, you'd be like, no, you still, right? And it's just human nature. We all have unique strengths. We all have areas that we can grow. That's a mindset that shows teachable. And that's the exact mindset we'd want for our kids. But as adults, that's humility as well, is recognizing like, yeah, if I'm doing great things, tell me I'm doing great things. So I'm affirmed in knowing and believing what I think. But in the same sense, if you've got ways to make me better, help me be better. You know why? Because that mindset wins for kids. And I would put my daughter in her classroom in a heartbeat. Why? Because she'll model for kids how to fail forward or how to grow or whatever the case might be.
Well, that's a perfect segue for the next question.
Sounds good.
We talk about failing a lot in teaching for students and teachers, that it's okay, but failing all the time, obviously not so good. So how do we ensure that if failure is happening, it's failing forward?
Yeah, and that's another area that I talk about a lot, or I'm certainly going to be writing about when my next book comes about, because I believe in the power in failing forward. So it comes back to truly, it's actually failing forward. I use that term often. I steal that from John Maxwell. He has an entire book called Failing Forward on that. But when we take a look, it's understanding that we're human and we're going to make mistakes. It's understanding that we will never be some perfect teacher. There's no point of like arriving. So starting on an admin end, one of the areas that I'll really challenge principals or, whoever it is, school leadership, is how do you model that? How do you model failing forward? That time that you screw something up in the faculty meeting, do you own it or do you push the blame? Here's why, because every time we fail forward, it's an opportunity for those that look up to us to see how to pull yourself back up and keep trying. So think about it from a teacher end, and like the example that you said and saying, it can be hard, and it absolutely can be hard. Why? Because you're being vulnerable, and that's not easy for anybody. It's being vulnerable, but it's also modeling for kids. As an example, if I'm a classroom teacher that comes across as somebody that knows it all, gets it all, and doesn't make mistakes, if I'm a kid, I can't relate to you. If I'm a kid, I don't understand what that looks like. So that vulnerability is just it's modeling humility. And to me, humility is truly one of the keys to education, to recognize that we're part of this. It's not about us in that regard. I look at one of the things that I'll often show, whether it's in a keynote or a workshop, there's one video on failure that I absolutely love. And it's funny because I'm a diehard New York Giants fan. So I grew up in New York. And even though I live in Pennsylvania, I live in Philadelphia Eagles country, which being a Giants fan in the past couple of years in Eagles country has been like a really, really hard thing personally. You can send me sympathy cards because it just hasn't gone well, right? So anyway, one of the clips that I'll often show is actually of Nick Foles. And what it is the video of Nick Foles it's about 12 hours after he wins the Super Bowl. So there he is. He's been named the Super Bowl MVP. The Eagles have won their first Super Bowl. He's standing in front of millions of people. The entire city's going crazy. And he's standing there in an interview, and they basically ask him like, Nick, what's next kind of thing? Or, how does it feel? And you know what he talks about? He doesn't talk about the teams that cut him. He doesn't like throw it in their face. He doesn't talk about like, this is why I should be the starter for the Eagles. He talks about how he learned from failure. He talks about it was the thousands of times he's gotten knocked down or messed it up that put him in position to fail forward and to learn from that. And he talks about that's where his family comes in. That's where his faith comes in. And you see this humility come through somebody that just got named like the highest honor you can. And you start to say, that's leadership. And so when we think about failing forward, it's an opportunity to display leadership regardless of what our role is. Whether we're that phys ed teacher, that health teacher, that first grade teacher, or that principal, it's an opportunity to model from those around you. Because the flip side too is going back to what I said earlier, like what's the alternative? Just lay flat on our face and model the kids when something doesn't go your way, you give up. And so that's not okay. Our kids deserve better than that. And so it's recognizing as a teacher, it's going to happen where you're going to have a lesson plan that doesn't go well. Just own it. And that's okay. And model it. And when something doesn't go your way, that's all right. One quick example of that is I'll share. I do like to share a lot of my failures, just in the sense of, I think for me, it's when speakers or other people, share their failures, I can relate to that. That humility is important to me. One of the things I'll often share with principals, an example here that I think any teacher can relate to as well, is I remember running this faculty meeting. I was an early principal at this point, and I ran a faculty meeting on a Monday, and for 60 straight minutes, it was the Tom show. It was like, we got to do this, and we got to do that. We got to do this, you got to do that. There's so much managerial stuff, right? It's just part of being a principal. It's just, it's part of that's out there. So 60 straight minutes, it's me just basically going out the lecture room. You got to do all this stuff, you know, like 1 minute later, the place is a ghost town, right? Next day I go in, I'm observing a classroom. I'm observing a math lesson for 52 straight minutes. It was pretty one directional. Like the teacher did some good things and used some humor and asked some questions, but it was really pretty one directional. Wednesday is a post observation and I'm sitting next to the teacher side by side, and I've got written in my notes, like when we've got this captive audience for 52 straight minutes, we can't really just talk at them the whole time. And I started to feel nauseous because like here I'm about to tell my teacher not to do exactly what I did to her on Monday. And I remember saying to her, and I won't say her name to protect the innocent, right? She's a great person. And I remember saying like, you know, like part of the feedback is, you know, just being one directional. And I can't end that sentence without saying, and when I ran the faculty meeting on Monday, like I did the exact same thing. Like, how do we both get better at that? And I will tell you, at least I was at a point in my career where I felt like I could be vulnerable, but I will tell you, it's very humbling to show to your teacher and call out to your teacher your poor instructional practice as a principal. But when I look at it and think about failing, like how could I model something different than I was expecting there, and realizing like I'm expecting my teachers to differentiate, to personalize, to meet people where they are. And what am I doing? I'm just doing one size fits all. I wasn't practicing what I was preaching. So for me, it was an opportunity to either own it or to be hypocritical in my work. And I finally chose to own it because I recognize like they see right through that anyway. And so failing forward is just truly key to growth.
So Tom, I just want to, when we jump over here to the learning spaces, that's been something I had the opportunity through my district to go down and visit Albemarle County, Virginia's school district down there with Ira Sokol, and just see what they were doing with their classroom environment and multi-age classrooms, etc. And so before we dig into that a little bit, just for the phys ed teachers that are part of our association, you've traveled the country, you've seen a lot of interesting learning spaces. Talk about the most unique and coolest phys ed learning space you've seen.
Oh, talk about putting me on the spot for that one, right?
If one comes to mind.
Yeah, no, I would say, so there's a variety of things that come to mind there. And first of all, shout out to Pam Moran, my buddy. I know she's retired now, but down in Albemarle, and Ira, I know Ira well as well. They did incredible work there in Albemarle. Incredible. I don't know if you saw the tree house when you were there. Like, yeah, they've done just amazing things down there. We actually wrote about them and part of Learning Transformed. Out your way, out in Western Pennsylvania, I believe some of you guys are out there, at least some of the folks watching. Actually, Chapter 4 highlighted Elizabeth Forward School District, and they've done incredible work around learning spaces as well out towards Pittsburgh, I think in Allegheny County, I think they're in. Yeah. But anyway, when you take a look at learning spaces related to phys ed, so one of the things that I would say that I've seen is related to things like CrossFit / like your what do you want to call it? Your cardio equipment too. It's almost like resembling a gym in that regard that I've seen. But again, that's part of the reason I hesitate showing things like that from the get-go is the money that's involved in creating things like that. I've seen like gaming rooms in phys ed where they're using things like Dance Dance Revolution to be able to, you know, like that's what it was back in the day or whatever. But a lot of that, like I hesitate to show because it's like, wow, look at the price tags, 100 grand, 150 grand. Like, so a lot of times when I talk learning spaces, it's often like from a learning sciences, what are the things we can do to improve our learning spaces that don't cost $1? And so that's often a way that I start to look at it in that regard. But when I think about some of the best spaces for phys ed, I think about options. I think about choice. I think about, you know, areas where kids have had like the, what's the word that I'm looking for? Can tell I need to get back to my gym. But I've seen some of the you know, a lot of like whether it's your cardio equipment or those kinds of things, but to me it's about being active in that regard, so also giving choice in that regard. But like some of the really fitness center-esque type things in terms of spaces that I've seen, they resemble what you'd go and you'd want to go work out to with, whether it's a CrossFit place or your Planet Fitness or whatever the case might be. If that's what, because when I think about things like phys ed, how do we get them sweating? How do we get them moving? How do we model healthy life type skills? Those are the kinds of things that I've seen in that regard, which, you know, are common on one hand, but I also recognize they cost a fortune to do well. And so I recognize that not every district, especially your rural districts, have the opportunities to spend that kind of money on certain things.
Well, thanks for that. Tom, I really want to be respectful of your time. So we're pushing that 45-minute mark now. So we're going to kind of cut to the end, and we like to end all of these episodes with something that I call Twitter advice, which is kind of an adaptation of Inside the Actors Studio ending that James Lipton did, where he asks what your favorite word is, what your favorite swear word is. We won't go there because we're educators and we're teachers, maybe off the air. So we're just gonna kind of rapid fire at you, and I call it Twitter advice because in 280 characters or less, kind of give us your answer and tell us what your thoughts were.
Okay.
As you're thinking about this. So
yeah, and Brian's really strict about the word count, so he's going to be counting your characters. So
count my character. All right, sounds good.
Stick to that.
Speaking of Brian, why don't you start us?
All right,
fire away, Brian. Go ahead, fire away.
In 280 characters or less, what is one thing to do right now to become a great teacher?
Never lose sight of your why, your purpose, your cause, and why you do what you do.
Nice.
Okay, good job. Next.
Yes, Jessica.
All right, most important learning that can occur for kids in school.
The most important learning that can occur?
Yes.
I would say it's related to agency in understanding yourself, how you learn, your passions, interests, etc. Period. Because that was under 280. It'd be less than a tweet. Got it.
So who are some of your favorite educators on Twitter and the internet that our viewers could follow if they haven't already?
Sure. People I learn from daily. I'll do a male list and a female list because to me, diversity in lenses is important. That doesn't count. No, that was my disclaimer. That doesn't count. So on the male side, I'd say Joe Sanfilippo, Eric Scheninger, Ken Williams, George Kuros, Dwight Carter, Matt Miller. On the female side, I would say Shannon Miller, Sarah Thomas, Brianna Hodges, Rosa Isaiah. I could go on and on and on, honestly. There's just so many people that impact the work that I do. And to me, it's important to have diverse lenses and people that don't all look like Tom Murray in my PLN so that I can learn from others.
What's the best advice you've ever gotten and who was it from?
My mentor, my first year teaching. Never lose sight of our world is about loving and caring about kids. Every single thing else is secondary to that. There's more to that story that I'll share at the keynote.
Brian?
All right, last one. What would your epitaph be on your office door?
Epitaph. Am I still alive? Or am I dead at this point?
Yeah, you'll be retiring.
Like the tombstone thing? All right. This isn't like my tombstone, right? Nobody's killed me off.
That one, my bad.
I would say the work is hard, but the kids are worth it.
Oh, that's awesome.
That's awesome.
That's awesome. So we had to use death imagery because one of the coolest things I ever heard you say when I watched the keynote online, as you talked about the cemetery effect. So I'm like, oh, you're a man after my own heart. You use death imagery too.
It's a Pennsylvania story. I talk about it sometimes with learning spaces. Not really in a keynote anymore. I mean, try and keep my keynotes fresh and relevant in that regard. But bringing it back to the spaces, it's a visual that people remember, and it's part of the reason I use it.
Absolutely. Well, Tom, thank you so much for taking some time out of your night here with your family to spend with us and talking about the book. And folks, we're going to have the books available at the convention. We're going to put them online. We're going to be buying a bunch of them. So if you're interested in learning Transformed, it is a phenomenal read. It is research heavy, so get ready. A lot of words in that book, but you will learn a lot and transform your learning.
And I'll just simply add to that anything you don't like was written by Eric Scheninger, and so it's the only thing I'll say to that.
Well, we can't wait to see you on December 6th. It's going to be awesome, and we're so thankful that you took some time to spend with us tonight.
Absolutely.
So, thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.